take a lot of notes as I work on projects, so I have a notebook for every project. And not only does that keep my data and my experimental work straight, but I also write as I go. And I find that if I have to actually put it on words, I understand it better.
I myself, I read and I have to write just for my learning. For when I'm teaching or learning something that I need to teach, I have to write my own notes. So I go from writing from just the little notes of the list that I have to do, the little notes of what it's easier for me to forget and everything, up to technical writing. So writing, I do it everywhere.
So my own sense for writing to learn is that the more you write, the more you learn.
As I'm writing, then what happens is that it gets me to think about things, and as I'm trying to put the words down, then I get to know, oh, well, let me think about this, let me think about that. It helps me to organize myself, it helps me to organize thoughts, put them down on a piece of paper, and then be able to just, come out with something coherent, unlike this talking where I'm just blabbing all over the place.
I don't feel that I've really processed through something until I have written about it. In terms of writing to learn, I do not like to type when I take notes in meetings. I encourage my students to do that too. I carry 2 journals around constantly, and write everything down because I will forget it otherwise. And I think that also helps me process it and remember things about the meetings and things I have to do. And so for me, that's really important.
I used to write by just kind of blathering it onto the page, and then I found that the revision process was horrible. So then I listened to my mom, who was an English major, in my head, and started outlining. And so now what I do is I make an outline of the entire paper, and then I make a list of the figures and a list of the tables. Then I create the figures and the tables. And in that way it's kind of like making the pictures to a storybook and then writing the story after you have the pictures. But for a scientist, the figures and the tables are where the real meaning is, because that's where you're illustrating your data. And then I work on the outline, and I go back to the outline and I work it until each paragraph is outlined, and the items under that paragraph heading are the topic sentence and the information that's going to be in it. And so I'll spend maybe 60 to 75% of my total time writing on the outline, because it's easier for me to move things around. And then once I have that outline, then it's just a matter of sitting down and writing each paragraph, but I have all the information that I need to write it. So the writing is actually really easy. It's the outlining that's hard.
I see it as a really creative process. I usually immerse myself in all the literature I possibly can about something and sit with it, and try and understand everything I can about a particular topic. And then I start writing down themes and gaps. I'm constantly writing in the corners of the papers that I'm reading and putting them in stacks according to the categories that I find, and then I write based on those categories.
I don't think you can emphasize enough how many times we rewrite. I mean, if we're colleagues and we're writing on a paper and it goes back and forth, and we're writing a paper to be submitted for a conference or something like that, that piece of paper may go 10 times between us before we ever even, maybe get a first draft or something, just to get the ideas, our different ideas, together in a cohesive one.
Yeah, actually it takes me a long time to do any writing, English being my second language. I think, I write it, and then because I still think in my native language. So I think it, I write it, I leave it, and then I come back to it. If it's due that day, I come back to it a few minutes later. If it's due later that week, I come back the next day, read it, and then think, what was I trying to say here? And I delete it, and I rewrite it, leave it. A few minutes later, I come back. So it takes me a lot of iterations, whether it's posting something on Canvas, writing an assignment for it to be, or the requirements for a final project, or even just an email making sure that what I'm saying it's correct, that I'm not writing back when I'm angry or when I'm upset. I give myself time and go back and edit everything that I write. So it takes me a long time. And yes, I have one draft, maybe a second, and then finally, maybe hopefully on the third one, I'll send it.
A lot of my time is spent crafting, taking the research that we've been conducted, writing it in APA style, which is the standard format for research articles in psychology, and then just a huge process of writing and rewriting and sending to collaborators and having them change things and me change things. So there's a lot of writing and rewriting of the same thing.
I think that I do so much of my thinking as I'm doing my initial draft that by the time I get it all down, just making it coherent just is a lot easier for me.
I have revised many of my assignments so many times. I took a course with Chris Burnham years ago, a writing across the curriculum course, and that made a huge difference for me in how I looked at the assignments I gave as a professor. And so, probably at least twice a semester for every assignment, if not more, it's been revised. And I have a few that I'm finally comfortable with that are a little more static now than they used to be. Important emails and stuff, I'll go back 2 or 3 times. Sometimes I'll sit on it a day or 2 even before I send it. I'm definitely one of those people who likes to write something, let it sit overnight, and then look at it with fresh eyes the next day and find, oh, I don't like the way that sounds, or this is too complicated, or I knew what I meant yesterday, but I don't know what I mean today, so clearly it needs to be revised yet again. So for me personally, that 24-hour, letting it just sit and cool without looking at it and then coming back to it, I find that helps my revision a lot.
I usually start, for me, by reading, because I have an idea of what it is I want to say or research or whatever. So I usually go to the literature first, and so then I take extensive notes. And then I try and organize it, and then I always use an outline, and then I start actually writing. And usually I write fast and a lot, and then I go back and edit.
So once you start involving other people and getting feedback and getting notes and hearing, their response to it, then suddenly that becomes a lot easier. And I have lots of different paths to try and lots of different voices in my head at that point, which I find liberating because I like to be around people and I like solving problems as a group. So for me, the drafting part is much lonelier and it shouldn't take any more time, but I procrastinate with that part of it, and but once the thing is alive, once it has some kind of spark and I'm going to reshape it and reform it and revise it to what it's supposed to be, that's very fun and very energizing.
If it's an article, I have a co-author, so obviously we go back and forth a lot. I'm an author on a textbook, so there's 3 authors on the team. So we all give feedback, we have an editor, and it goes out for peer review. So often, a journal article, even if after I've gotten feedback from a co-author or other people, goes out for review, and then the reviewers give us more feedback to respond to.
I edit everything that I write, even if it's just an email. And so it has to be grammatically correct.
Even in a discipline like geology, there are different journals with very different audiences. And so it's important to be able to write to that particular audience. Another thing I've really learned is that in a discipline, I'm assuming other scientific disciplines are the same, we really tend to write to other PhDs in our subdiscipline. We don't so much write to a more general audience. And I've had colleagues tell me that they use my papers in their undergraduate and graduate classes to help them see how to write, but just understand basic ideas about the discipline, because I've kind of written to a more general audience. I think one of the things that makes it hard to do interdisciplinary science is that we're writing to people who already pretty much know what we're talking about. We're not writing to a different audience. So I'm very aware of audience.
Everything that I write is meant for an audience, and so I think it's very important to know especially early on, like how are people responding to that, and is that the intended response, or if it isn't, then do I need to reshape something, or did I just make a new discovery, and so that can't happen in a vacuum, really. And so I think it's really vital to the work to have response from people. Plus, it's not. I mean, nothing is ever gonna live alone in a closet in a small dark room. You have to have, you want to make sure that the things you're writing, and I would assume for people who write academically as well, that it's it's hitting your target audience, and that it makes sense. Sometimes these things, in our heads are lots of words whirling around, and we puke them out, and then they don't say what we think that they say. And you need some objectivity, and that's what I think sharing it with other people brings.
If I'm trying to draft something and I don't have a target journal in mind, there's no point writing it. So so first I sit down and think about where am I going to put this, and I often get feedback on that, what do you think about this journal versus that journal or whatever. And then based on that, if it's a journal thing, I go and read the criteria and what they're looking for and blah, and then I tailor my writing to that. If it's for majors versus non-majors, if it's for upper division versus lower division, all of that comes into play.
Totally. I mean, I think that it's really important, especially with emails. You can really be dangerous with emails. If you're not thinking about your audience, if you're not editing what you're writing, especially in a business environment. As a nurse, everything we do, we have to think about our patients. We have to think about how our writing, how they can understand our writing. So to me, it's normal just to be thinking about the audience. I certainly, when I'm talking to patients, counseling them, I'm certainly editing how I speak to not insult them, but just to talk at the level that they understand. And certainly when I'm writing stuff for them or instructing them, I'm also writing at a level where I think that they can basically understand stuff. So when it comes to formal documents for papers and stuff, obviously I'll use more sophisticated words and stuff. But again, it depends on the audience.
If I'm writing to a physician, that needs to be in one language. If I'm writing for my students, that's completely yet another. If I'm trying to give good information to a patient, that needs to be in layman's terms and everyday terms that they can understand and absorb. So lots of translation as well as revision, and lots of different audiences that I write to. And I will often give the same information in 3 different styles and formats and in 3 different language levels, because I'm writing to 3 different audiences the same information.